Hi guys, I'm Vaneshri Abrahams. Today we're going to look at the civil resistance in South Africa. We'll start off with a checklist. Make sure you know the structure of the exam paper. You understand the concepts related to the theme. You apply the skills to analyze different types of sources. And lastly, you are able to construct a coherent argument using evidence in an extended writing question, which is your essay question. I'm going to go through the content overview with you in the form, I've done it in the form of a flow chart. I will explain to you as we go along. We'll start off with the 1960s. You would see it started off with the National Party dominating the government of South Africa with the policy of apartheid that was enforced. And in the 1960s, there was opposition to apartheid, and with it grew increased resistance from liberation movements. We now look at the 1970s. One of those liberation movements is known as the Black Consciousness Movement. You need to know the nature and aims of the BCM, the abbreviation of the Black Consciousness Movement. Going down, you need to understand the role that Steve Biko had with his ideas and writings, and also the changing views of the apartheid state of the BCM, the Black Consciousness Movement. Also in the 1970s, the challenge posed by the BCM to the state of apartheid, the governance at the time. Moving on to 1976, the famous Soweto Uprising and the influence that the BCM had on the people of South Africa. We're going to look at the reaction of the Bantu education system, very important, you need to understand that, and the students protesting against the introduction of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction. In fact, that is one of the core events that took place in the 1970s. Moving on to the next period of the movement is from 1976 to 1980. We're looking at the legacy of the BCM. Some of the important things you need to know for this part of the paper is that you need to understand that it filled the void in the black resistance after the banning of the ANC and PAC. It also provided new leadership and a new resistance to the movement. Going on, it also encouraged other organizations like the educational sector, the health sector, and other community projects to improve the lives of black people. If we move on to the flow chart, we look at the early 1980s and the contradictions of apartheid, the pass laws that broke down, and the reliance of black labor. Secondly, we look at the 1982 Bantu Authorities Act, and lastly, very important, the 1983 tricameral system that the apartheid government instituted to kind of bring reforms, but in fact brought about more resistance. If we move on, we're looking at the late 1980s, very, very important for your extended writing question, the crisis of apartheid and the response to Botha's reforms. With this came the growth of trade unions, then the formation of the UDF, actually the United Democratic Front. you would find that there are abbreviations which I've put in the flowchart, but I will go through it with you in some detail. Moving on, we're looking at the role of the Black Sash movement. This was a group of white women who believed in the liberation struggle and joined in the civil resistance in South Africa. Following that, we had the emergence of the MDM, which was when the UDF was banned and the mass democratic movement began. Going on, we're looking at the End Conscription Campaign. At this stage in the late 1980s, the country is now ungovernable. It's becoming very, very difficult for the apartheid government to continue with its laws because of the growing resistance that's going on in the country. Moving on, I would like to look at an exam question, actually a few exam questions that are typical exam questions for paper 2. One important thing you need to know is that analyzing sources, very key to understanding the sources. When working with sources, it is very important that one asks the following questions. We're looking at the 5 W questions and the 1 H question. It doesn't need to follow in any specific order, and I'm going to help you through with it. For example, firstly, when looking at a source, ask yourself, who produced the source? Then, when was it produced? In that instance, we're looking at which time. It could be a date, it could be a day, it could be a year that was mentioned. So we're looking at when was it produced. Thirdly, why? Very important in history. Why was the source produced? What was the purpose of producing the source? What was the purpose of writing the source? What was the purpose of presenting the source in the form of a cartoon or a picture or a photograph? Fourthly, where was the source written? Here we're looking at the place. Fifthly, what is the source about? And finally, how is the source produced? Moving on, we're going to use an exam question as an example. And I'm going to work through those 5 W question and the 1 H question. Let's look at the analysis of sources. Remember, I've mentioned to you, very important, take the time to analyze the source before you actually go and answer the question. In that way, you will be able to better understand the source and apply yourself effectively. This is source 1A. The extract below focuses on the philosophy of Black consciousness. Let's ask ourselves, what is the source about? It's about the Black consciousness movement and its philosophy. Let's look at who produced the source. It was written by M.V. Mzamane. It's obviously a collection of books. We know that by looking at this because it says volume 2, and the title of the source is The Road to Democracy. Let's look at the second question. When was it produced? From the source, we cannot say when it was produced. There's no indication of that, but that's fine. You can go on to the next question. Why was the source produced? In other words, what was the purpose of producing the source? What was the intent of the writer in producing the source? Very important. Fourthly, where was the source written? It was written in South Africa. It's a text, The Road to Democracy in South Africa. It's a black author, so we can assume that it was written in South Africa. Moving on, what is the source about? I've mentioned earlier when I started off that clearly the source is about the philosophy of black consciousness. In fact, it gives detailed information about the philosophy. Moving on, how is the source written? Howard referred to, is the source biased? Does it give factual information? Does it give accurate information? Can one rely on this information? Would the source be useful to an historian studying the philosophy of black consciousness? Moving on. Let's look at an example. This is adapted from paper 2, the exemplar paper, question 1.1.1. Let's look specifically at the question. It says, what? Remember, what? According to the source. So it's very important that you actually refer to the source. Were the main aims of the philosophy of black consciousness? I'd like you to remember, very important, looking at the mark scheme, because that will give you an indication on how much to write. In this specific question, all you need to do is write 2 points to get 2 marks. 1 point for each, 1 mark for each point mentioned. If we go on, looking at the source, let's ask ourselves what, according to the source, are the main aims of the philosophy of black consciousness. What you can do is underline the key words that kind of explain what the philosophy of black consciousness is all about. If you look at key words, certainly it was the breeding, it was a doctrine, a teaching of self-emancipation and a strategy for escape from the political doldrums, the state of stagnation into which South Africa had been cast into the 1960s. That tells you a lot about the philosophy of black consciousness. Moving on, certainly it was a breeding ground for a new generation of leaders. Other keywords, it focused on a liberation strategy. Moving on, it launching a student movement and adult political organization. The tasks of the BCA, telling you what they actually went around teaching people, were to basically uplift the sagging spirits, the discouraging spirits of black people at the time, and to raise the battered self-esteem and to affirm the identity, to assert human dignity, to fight off apathy, like the source says, and turn racial stereotypes off their heads. It also sought to get rid of the arsenal, the collection of complexes that haunted and kept down individuals and communities, to instill self-confidence, very important, self-reliance, also important, to revive, that's an important word, the masses, that is the masses of the black people in their struggle for freedom. Now let's look at the answer. to see whether we are on the right track. And that is your answer. You can see from underlining the keywords, certainly it was self-emancipation. It allowed black people to become self-reliant, to move away from becoming apathetic and stagnant, to accord dignity to the downtrodden and the oppressed. Okay, that gives us a few alternatives to the answer. Remember, students, that the question asks you for only two. Remember not to write too much and to write according to the mark allocation. So out of these three answers, all you need to do is give me 2 times 1, which will give you 2 ticks each and a total of 2 marks. Now that wraps up question 1. Now for an ad break. Welcome back, learners, from your ad break. I trust that you are refreshed and ready to continue. In this segment, we'll be looking at question 2. We'll be looking at a visual source and how to interpret that source. If we look at question 2, 2.1, it says, study source 1D. 2.1, what message does this cartoon convey regarding Biko? 2.2, comment on the significance of the caption in the cartoon, which is Biko, 20 years on, an indelible legacy. Remember, learners, I've mentioned before, you've got to take note of the mark scheme. If you go back to question 2.1, it's 1 point for 2 marks, which gives you a total of 2 marks. Question 2.2, it's 2 points for 2 marks, which gives you 4 marks. Now let's have a look at source 1D. It says, this cartoon, drawn by Zapiro, famous cartoonist, commemorates the legacy of the former black consciousness leader, Stephen Bantu Biko's struggle against the apartheid regime. Remember those 5W question and the 1H question? Very important in analyzing the question. I hope you've not forgotten that. Let's look at the cartoon. Very interesting cartoon. If you look at the name of Biko, highlighted in big bold writing, the caption, 20 years on, an indelible legacy, the face of Steve Biko, and obviously it's written on the 12th of September in the Sowetan. Let's ask ourselves, what is the source about? It's about Steve Biko, a picture of him, very boldly pointed out, his name, Biko, given to you, and the caption. Very important, let's look at the size of his name. Big, bold writing, it says much. It highlights that this source is clearly focusing on Steve Biko. If you look at the shape of his face, is actually the shape of South Africa, showing that he is the face of South Africa. 20 years on, the caption, again, showing that for 2 decades, he left a lasting legacy. Also very important, actually very interesting that the background is black and his name is written in white, and so his face painted in white. There is a lot that one can get out of the source, and interesting information before you actually go on answering the question. The white could suggest that he brings light to the darkness that surrounds civil society in the 1970s. The idea of his entire face taking the shape of South Africa, meaning that he has influenced black people in South Africa through his writings, through his speeches, through his presence. And the caption, 20 years on, 20 years after Steve Biko made his mark in South African history, his legacy still lasts. Now let's look at the answers. Here we go. Here we have the answers. It commemorates Biko's political influence in South Africa during the 1970s. Steve Biko served as an inspiration for most South Africans, and Biko's ideas had a huge impact on South Africa. That will explain the message of the cartoon. Very simply, any one of these 3 points given. Remember, it's only 1 point for 2 marks each. If we go to 2.2, we've highlighted the important keywords in the question. We've got to comment on the significance of the caption, which says, Biko, 20 years, an indelible legacy. Let's look at the answer. Here we go. Biko left a firm and long legacy on the struggle of freedom. Secondly, the ideas of Steve Biko are still relevant today. It's still making a mark amongst the people of South Africa. He's still remembered for what he did for black people. And he's regarded as the foremost political hero and martyrs in South Africa, 20 years after he made his mark. Remember, the question asks you to give 2 points for 2 marks each, which would give you a total of 4. If we go on to the next question, looking at question 3. This is a paragraph question. Very often learners get confused with writing everything they need or have on hand on the question. Very important, look at what the question is asking you to do. Let's have a look at the question. It asks you to use all the sources in the relevant text. Your own knowledge is important. Having background information does give one some kind of kickstart to the question. You've got to write a paragraph of about 8 lines. Very important. Keep to what the question asks you to do. Do not write too little, neither do you write too much. What is the question asking you to do? Write a paragraph of about 8 lines on how the ideas of black consciousness challenged the apartheid regime. Let's have a look at some of those keywords before we actually look at all the sources. Very important, guys, in history, you've got to understand the question before you actually answer the question. It's pointless having to blindly go into the question without having to understand what the examiner asks you to do. Let's look at the first line. You've got to use all the sources. The key word is all, very important. Relevant sources. Your own knowledge, like I've explained, background information does give one a kickstart. Let's go to the exact question. Going on further, you've got to explain why the ideas of black consciousness challenge the apartheid government. You've got to say how the ideas of black consciousness kind of opposed, resisted, asked the apartheid government to question the apartheid policy and in that way challenge. The word challenge means to oppose, to kind of resist actively, to kind of question the existing government policy. Now let's look at all the relevant sources. If we move on to actually looking at the source, we've looked at source 1A, which focuses on the philosophy of the black consciousness, giving very detailed information on the ideas and ideology of black consciousness. If we look at source 1B, this source describes the organization that were established as a result of the philosophy of black consciousness. Remember and keep in mind that the black consciousness was an umbrella organization, and underneath that organization, many other freedom liberation movements began. Going straight on to the source, let's look at the keywords of the source. I will not go through the entire source with you. We'll just look at some key ideas. If we look at the first few lines, it speaks about younger teachers in Soweto coming from ethnically divided campuses of Fort Hare and the University of North, simply saying that they come from different cultural backgrounds, traditional backgrounds, but with the same idea of coming together as black people with one purpose, that is to develop a sense of self-reliance and self-confidence, a confidence in being black. With this, they formed the organization called SASO, which was the South African Student Organization. The organization was based on the philosophy of black consciousness and certainly associated with none other than Steve Biko. Moving on to other important information, it speaks about young professionals having a major impact on emerging student organization, such as the South African Student Movement. The abbreviation for that is the SASM, which were founded in schools. If we go on, some accounts even refer to the SASM and the SASO reflected the growing excitement felt by young black people. It was inspired by the workers' strikes of 1973 in Durban, focusing on another event that kind of catapulted what took place in 1976 onwards. The fall of the Portuguese regimes in Angola and Mozambique, the influence of other African states on the people of South Africa, the black people of South Africa, and the successes of resistant movements in the war in Rhodesia. Very important. Let's ask ourselves very quickly, what is the source about? It focuses on the influence that the black consciousness movement had on other little organizations that fell under the umbrella body of black consciousness, filtering into universities, into schools, into communities. Let's look at who wrote the source. It was by E. Brink, focusing on June 16, 1976, and it was recollected 25 years later. So certainly we know from this it was not a first-hand information source. Moving on to the next source, 1C. This extract focuses on the reaction of the apartheid government to the philosophy of black consciousness in the 1970s. So basically telling us how the apartheid government reacted to the black consciousness movement. If we go on, it speaks about SASO's ability to pull off simultaneous boycotts, very, very prominent in the 1970s, which contributed to the perception that the black consciousness was a threat. Now, at this stage, the government is seeing the black consciousness as more of a threat than anything. The Minister of State Security followed the banning of 8 NUSAS leaders by the banning of the leadership of SASO and the BPC. If we move on, we're looking at people like Biko, very important, other leaders like Cooper, Moodley, all prominent black philosophy or black consciousness thinkers and idealists. You can see clearly it focuses on the influence of the black consciousness movement. These were organizations were banned in their hometowns and forbidden to attend public meetings or publish. Moving on, they were still consulted, it says, but these and subsequent bannings paved the way for a new generation like Tiro, which made a significant influence by organizing and theorizing, but also confronting the state. Remember, keep in mind the question. The question is asking you to write a paragraph on how the ideology of black consciousness challenged the apartheid government. And clearly we see this in the source. There is a lot of information that you can get out of the source to answer that question. So clearly we can say that it is relevant. If we go on, it speaks about a new generation of leaders expressed in excitement, and thousands of Africans freely celebrated in places like Maputo, and with considerable understatement in the events would affect white South Africa. White South Africans at this stage are starting to feel very, very threatened. Moving on, it speaks about as winter turned to spring, the announcement of a nationwide series of rallies to commemorate the occasion at in Durban at Currie Fountain Sports Ground and in Johannesburg, and still highly organized and militant University of the North. When we move on to the source, other keywords that you can look at is how people rallied together and started to rise up against the apartheid government. Things like police raids broke up rallies of thousands of people, each at Currie's Fountain and Turf Loop. Dozens of leaders were detained, the result of that kind of uprising, as well as the entire leadership of SASO, BPC, and the University of North were banned. So that was the result of people resisting. If we move on to the source, it speaks about as 1974 closed, more than 60 black consciousness activists remained in detention. So while there was a growing resistance, the government started to kind of tighten up their policy by banning people, by picking up and increasing their security forces. Let's move on to source 1D, which we have analyzed before. Now let's look at the answer. Here we go, learners. You should have the following responses in your answer. you've got to include that the black consciousness instilled a sense of self-pride, discipline, assertiveness, not just sitting back and saying it's okay to be treated badly, it's okay to be oppressed. The philosophy of black consciousness was to kind of create this idea that you are not inferior because you are black, kind of raising the awareness amongst people and changing their mindset from an inferior complex. It exposed the negative effects of the Bantu Education Act that is being taught in Afrikaans or as a medium in Afrikaans, which was very, very difficult for black people. And knowing this, the apartheid government asked that it become a law. Moving on, it increased political consciousness amongst black South Africans. We see that in source 1A and B. Very important, learners, in this question or in a paragraph question where the examiner asks you to focus on sources, please make sure that you make reference to the source, because you give the examiner the idea that you know what is happening in this question. You know which sources to look at, and it's easy for the examiner to kind of get what you are trying to say. So if you are referring to a source, mention this is seen in source 1A, or this is evident in source 1B. This is highlighted in source 1C. It is clear that this can be seen in source 1D. That will help you to get through your paragraph question. Keeping in mind, you don't just write everything you know about the black consciousness or everything that you find in the source about the black consciousness. You've got to keep in mind always exactly what the question is asking you to do, and that is how the philosophy of black consciousness challenged the apartheid government. Now let's look at more answers. If we go on, very important, the black consciousness did fill the gap and void left by banned organizations. Like the ANC, we see that in source 1C. In source 1B and C, it is mentioned that young generation was inspired that being black South African was actually worth fighting for. So people were becoming kind of stronger in fighting against the apartheid government and kind of feeling more confident that they could do so. Very important, you need to mention that the black South Africans wanted to collectively end apartheid, a kind of sense of unity and togetherness, which brings about a greater resistance against the apartheid government. And also another important point that you will get out of the sources as well is that there is a refusal to accept inferior education. And we see that in the 1976 Soweto Uprising, and how students decided to take up a stand and say, no, we will not be taught in Afrikaans. If you go on to more answers, we know that in source 1B, it led to the formation of SASO. It also broke away from white-dominated organization. And clearly, it was something that Steve Biko felt very, very strongly about. He believed that blacks should fight their own struggle for freedom if they really wanted it. And it set up community structures such as the Zanampilo Clinic, and it also inspired student boycotts and marches. So that would kind of give you an overview on how to answer a paragraph question. Remember, keep in mind exactly what the question asks you to focus on, and that is how black consciousness challenged the apartheid government. Remember also, when examiners mark a paragraph question, you don't get a mark for every point you mentioned. A rubric is used. That will be provided for you in the memo, and it will give you an idea of how it is marked. Now guys, let's have an ad break. Think about the things that I've mentioned to you about paragraph questions, interpreting sources, a visual source, and when we get back, we'll look at an essay question. Welcome back, learners, from your ad break. In this segment, we're going to look at an essay question. What I plan to do is go through the structure of your essay and then look at the actual evidence that needs to be in your essay. Let's have a look. We're looking at question 4. Let's read the question. It reads, the apartheid government's attempt to strengthen its position resulted instead mounting resistance, which by 1989 became unstoppable. Very important in essay writing is that you read the question first, have an idea of the statement in question. It gives you kind of how or where your essay should be going. The question is asking you, do you agree with this view? In your answer, examine the impact of the 1983 tricameral constitution and the internal resistance that followed. Let's go back to the statement in question and highlight the important words. We know that definitely it's focusing on the apartheid government's attempt to strengthen its position. In doing so, it resulted in mounting resistance, which by 1989, the resistance had become unstoppable. Again, this question focuses on civil society protest in the 1970s going up to the 1989, and very, very good for you to do is kind of do a quick sketch of what the essay requires of you to do. If you go on to the question is asking you whether you agree with this view. So you've got to take that stance, whether you agree or whether you don't. In your answer, you have to examine the impact that the 1983 tricameral constitution, which was one of Botha's reforms, and the internal mass resistance that followed. So if we look at the question, if we kind of brainstorm the question, it's basically telling you that the apartheid government's attempt to kind of tighten its policy actually just furthered the resistance. If you look at the words in the statement, keywords like strengthen, that would tell you that it kind of resistance, the mounting resistance, it increased the resistance. That in 1989, that resistance became unstoppable. In other words, it could not be stopped. And the apartheid government struggled to kind of bring the resistance to a halt, and thereby kind of tightening up their security measures. We'll talk about the state of emergency and the ongoing resistance that took place that made the apartheid government to be kind of ungovernable. If you look at the essay question again, you've got to have an introduction, you've got to have a body with many paragraphs, and you've got to tie up your argument in your conclusion. A very good way to start your introduction is actually to use words from the question. So if you say, if you've made the stance whether you agree or not, you can start off by doing that, or you can go on to kind of rephrasing the question or the statement. You could start off by saying the apartheid government's attempt to strengthen its position resulting in mounting resistance. You can agree with the statement or disagree. Remember not to use the words I. You've got to write in the third person. So words like one does agree with the statement. A good way to kind of also start your introduction is to indicate to the examiner how you plan to answer the question. So you could say one, in this essay, one would discuss the how the reforms like the tricameral system of 1983 led to the mounting resistance. And going on to your body, highlighting each point on a new paragraph. Remember, do not jump from one idea to the next. Having a chronological order helps the flow of your essay. That always is a good thing to do. And finally, in your conclusion, remember not to mention any new points, and go back to your introduction and see what you've said there and tie up your argument. So let's look at the information that you need to include in your essay. In your introduction, let's have a look at what you should have in your introduction. During the 1980s, the apartheid government, because that is what we're talking about, under P.W. Botha, adopted a new policy in an attempt to retain control. This was the total strategy. These policies only increased resistance to apartheid both within South Africa and outside South Africa. But remember, in your essay, we focus mainly, in fact, completely on internal resistance. Now let's have a look at what you would include in your body. Let's look at the total strategy. These were limited reforms like the abolition of the past system, that is kind of letting down their guard in terms of the past laws, the legalizing of black trade unions to an extent, also not forgetting the Bantu Local Authorities Act, where black homelands were kind of given a little leeway on their independence to kind of rule on their own. And also, very important, the 1983 tricameral constitution. Very, very important. The government saw it as a reform, but the people of South Africa actually saw it as an insult, because it was not total freedom. It was not giving black people any kind of freedom, and it limited their kind of say in how the government should run. If you go on to other points you should have in your body, would be increased repression of that opposition, things like the state of emergency when the government became ungovernable, the bannings of the ANC, more detentions without trial, the army moving into the township. So really kind of tightening up security measures. So basically looking at how they could tighten up their apartheid policy, only to bring up more resistance. We see in this period also there's an increased resistance, more strikes, more stayaways, and the one thing that became a sore point for the blacks in South Africa and non-whites in South Africa was the tricameral system, and thereby leading to a mass boycott of the first tricameral election. In the townships, there was again a growing revolt against community councils, because they also saw it as a way of more repression by the apartheid state. and the opposition to the End Conscription Campaign, where white soldiers felt that they didn't want to do this anymore. They felt they are fighting for a country that does not have freedom, and it was not really worth it. Mass marches took place in townships, in cities, in residential areas, in public places. New opposition organizations emerged, the formation of the UDF, the civic organization, the End Conscription Campaign, which is abbreviated as the ECC, and also the formation of the mass democratic movement after the banning of the UDF. Moving on, learners, we're looking at increasing international opposition, which in this essay is not needed, but if you mention it, you've got to tie it up with the question. And finally, your conclusion, mentioning that by the end of the 1980s up to 1989, it was very clear that the total strategy failed. The reforms that Botha wanted to put in place to tighten up the apartheid policy actually led to more and more resistance, to a point where the government was now becoming frustrated. The people were going on with mounting resistance, and the country was becoming ungovernable. Reforms made were widely rejected by many people in South Africa, many organizations. Greater resistance within South Africa, the formation of the UDF and MDM, and the government's position was actually made worse, which was not their intention at the start of the new decade, moving on from 1980. Okay, guys, that's it from me. I hope that you've learned a lot. Questions have become clear to you. You have an understanding how to analyze types of sources. I wish you well for the exams, and good luck.